The rain drizzled all night, tapping steadily against the old tin roof, a soft patter blending with the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Irene woke up from a restless dream, someone's voice still echoing faintly in her mind. She sat up, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and felt the cold air seeping in through the cracks of the door. The small house was dark, lit only by the dim yellow glow of the hallway lamps spilling across the stained wall. From the living room came a faint sound. She got up carefully, not wanting to wake Jacob, but just as she reached the doorway, a low, trembling voice broke the silence, a voice so familiar it pierced straight through her heart. "Don't call me your son anymore." Irene froze. Jacob was sitting in the dark, his back against the sofa, eyes glinting with the pale light from his phone screen. His face was rigid, his lips quivering as if he had just forced out the most painful words of his life. "Jacob, what are you saying?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "You know exactly what I mean. Stop pretending." Before Irene could respond, Jacob sprang to his feet, threw the phone onto the table, and strode back to his room, slamming the door shut. The sharp click of the lock echoed coldly. The living room fell into silence again. Irene stood there, hollow and still. On the table, the phone screen glowed faintly, showing the last message. "He told me everything." She sat down, her hands trembling. "He's just being rebellious," she told herself. "Teenagers say things they don't mean." But inside, something dark and heavy began to rise, fear. A vague, suffocating fear. Jacob wasn't the same boy who used to curl up next to her on movie nights, laughing at old jokes. Lately, he had grown distant, cold, and in his eyes, there was something unfathomable, like a bottomless pit. She walked to his door and knocked softly. "Jacob, honey, what's going on? I just want to talk." No answer. Only the faint sound of music leaking from his headphones, a slow, sorrowful tune looping endlessly. Irene lingered there for a few minutes, then finally gave up and returned to her room, where the desk lamp still cast its pale light over a scatter of papers. Beside it stood an old picture frame, a photo of her and Jacob when he was little, his arms wrapped around her neck, smiling brightly. She touched the cold glass, whispering, "My sweet boy, what's happening to you?" Downstairs, the wind slipped through the cracks, howling eerily. Irene stayed awake until dawn, unable to close her eyes. Her son's words kept echoing in her head. "Don't call me your son anymore." At 3 a.m, her phone buzzed with a new message. No name, just a string of unfamiliar numbers. You should have told him the truth. Irene stared at the screen, feeling the blood in her veins turn to ice. The next morning, Irene woke up with swollen red eyes from a sleepless night. She made herself a cup of coffee and stood quietly by the window, watching the drizzle outside. The little kitchen was neat and still, everything in its usual place as if last night had been nothing more than a hazy dream. But when she saw Jacob's phone on the table, its screen still glowing with a new message, her heart clenched again. He hadn't left his room. He didn't come out for breakfast either. Irene could only hear the sound of his slow footsteps pacing back and forth inside. Then the door creaked open. He stepped out with his backpack slung over his shoulder, his face unreadable. "Are you heading to school?" she asked, forcing a soft smile. Jacob didn't look at her. "I've got something to do," he muttered, and the door closed behind him. The hum of his electric bike faded into the rain, leaving Irene standing alone in the kitchen, clutching a cup of cold coffee. There was a time when mornings were the warmest moments of their day. Jacob would always wake up late, hair messy, still making sure to finish the slice of bread she baked for him. He'd smile, wrap his arms around her and ask, "Mom, when I grow up, will you still bake for me?" And Irene would always answer, "As long as you still call me Mom, I'll keep baking." Those memories came flooding back like old film reels, tender and aching. She remembered his 10th birthday, when he made her a bracelet out of leather cord, clumsy, uneven, but precious. She still wore it to work every day, like a tiny charm called Jacob. But things had changed. For the past 6 months, Jacob had grown quiet, withdrawn. He ate alone, came home late, barely spoke a word. Sometimes Irene stayed up past midnight and still didn't hear the sound of his bike outside. When she asked, he simply said, "Group work at school." Irene believed him. She wanted to believe him. But strange things began to happen. Late-night phone calls, a mysterious letter addressed to Jacob, and that look in his eyes a mix of anger and pity, as if she'd done something unforgivable. That evening, Irene returned home after a night shift. The dinner plate she had left out for Jacob was untouched. The house was silent, suffocatingly so. As she passed by his room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, a faint light from the computer spilling across the floor. She stepped inside. On the desk were several old papers, as if Jacob had been searching for something. A stack of documents lay open among them, his birth certificate, folded at the line that listed his father's name. Irene froze. Why would he be looking for that? Next to it was a torn photograph, her and a young man in a suit, both smiling, but the man's face had been ripped away, leaving only her half and a hand resting on her shoulder. On the back, written in thick black marker, were the words, "You lied to me." The photo slipped from her fingers. Her heartbeat quickened, cold sweat tracing down her spine. Jacob knew something, and someone had told him. She folded the picture and tucked it into her pocket, her hands trembling. It felt as if the past she had spent years burying was cracking open, leaking out the one truth she had feared the most. She looked toward the window. Raindrops streamed down the glass, blurring the reflection of a tired woman in her 40s. Irene whispered a silent prayer. "If the past has truly come back, please spare my son." From Jacob's room came the sharp slam of a cabinet door. He emerged, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment, cold, distant, and filled with something that looked like hate. No words passed between them, only the sound of rain, steady, relentless, and the heavy silence of a mother's heart slowly sinking into the darkness of despair. The next morning, Irene woke with the hollow feeling of someone who had just stepped out of a nightmare that refused to end. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, but they weren't enough to chase away the chill clinging to the house. She made a cup of coffee and sat quietly on the couch, staring at the torn photograph lying on the table. Jacob had already left for school. No footsteps, no goodbye. Only an empty chair and a bowl of untouched cereal. Irene sighed softly, her gaze drifting toward the wooden shelf where she kept old keepsakes, things she hadn't touched in years. Something inside her urged her to move. She pulled up a chair, reached for a dusty brown box labeled "Jacob, Baby's First Year." The handwriting had faded. When she opened it, a bittersweet smile crossed her face. Tiny photos of her baby wrapped in blankets, his little hand clutching her finger, a lock of his first hair. And at the bottom, tucked away carefully, a yellow envelope. Across the front, written hurriedly in black ink, were the words, "Keep it, for his safety." Irene's hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was an old birth certificate, and one detail made her freeze. The father's name wasn't David Ross. It was Michael Dean, a man who didn't exist. Her heart stopped for a beat. She remembered that day vividly, the day she begged a friend at the registrar's office to change the father's name. All she wanted was to protect Jacob from that dark past, from a name forever stained, from a shame he didn't deserve to inherit. But now, every lie she had ever told was turning against her. The sound of the front door broke her thoughts. Jacob came in, still wearing his school uniform, his expression cold and distant. Irene quickly folded the paper and hid it in her hand. "You're not going to class?" she asked gently. Jacob set his bag down without looking at her. I have something more important to do today. Irene bit her lip, her chest tightening as she looked at him. He was nearly her height now, thin, pale, and with eyes that once held warmth but now glinted with frost. "Jacob," she began, her voice trembling, "if something I did made you angry, please tell me. I'll explain." "Explain?" He cut her off with a dry laugh. "Are you finally going to tell me about him? About why you never said his name?" The question sliced through the air like a blade. Irene stepped back, speechless. Jacob's gaze locked onto hers. "I met him," he said, his voice low but burning. "He told me everything. He said you're the reason he lost everything. You call that protecting me? Or was it just your way of hiding your own guilt?" Irene opened her mouth, but her voice cracked. "You don't understand, Jacob. What happened between your father and me, it's complicated." "Stop lying," he shouted. "You've been lying for 16 years. He's not the monster you made him out to be. He's the victim." Irene stood frozen. Jacob's eyes shimmered not just with anger, but with heartbreak. "You know what?" he said quietly, his voice trembling. "When I looked into his eyes, I saw myself there. I look like him, not you." And with that, he turned away, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the silent house. Irene stood there, hollow, her heart collapsing inward. Every word she had wanted to say caught in her throat. She sank onto the chair, clutching the birth certificate as tears streamed down her face. She knew then what she had buried all these years wasn't just a man's name. It was a truth she herself had been too afraid to face, and now that truth was no longer buried. It was alive in the fury, the eyes, and the voice of her own son. That afternoon, gray clouds blanketed the sky. Irene sat by the window, watching the endless rain fall in thin, silvery lines. On the table before her lay the old, crumpled birth certificate, its folds worn soft from being opened and read too many times. She had stared at it all morning, yet every time her eyes met that forged name, her chest tightened again. Michael Dean. That false name felt like an old wound ripped open. Irene couldn't stop wondering, had Jacob somehow found the real document? Or had someone else given him the truth she'd kept buried for 16 years? She couldn't just sit there any longer. She needed to know who was stirring up the past. Pulling on her raincoat, she stepped outside. The narrow road leading toward the old neighborhood was slick with water, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. She made her way down the slope to the last house on the lane, the home of Mrs. Eunice, her elderly neighbor, who had watched her raise Jacob from the time he was a baby. When Irene entered the small yard, Mrs. Eunice was sitting under the porch, knitting quietly. Her eyes, warm but sharp, lifted toward Irene. "Out in this weather, dear?" Her voice was low and husky. Irene nodded, forcing a faint smile. "I just needed to ask you something. Have you seen anyone unusual around here lately?" Mrs. Eunice paused, the knitting needles stilling in her hands. "Unusual how?" Irene clenched her fists inside her pockets. "A man, early 40s, tall, dark hair. He might have lived here before, years ago." A heavy silence fell. Mrs. Eunice set the yarn aside and looked directly at her. "You're talking about David Ross, aren't you?" The name made Irene's body go rigid. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "You've seen him?" Mrs. Eunice sighed. "Last week, a man came by asking about your house. Said he was looking for a boy named Jacob. I thought he was some old friend, but the way he spoke, it sent chills down my spine. He kept saying it was time the boy knew the truth." Irene's blood ran cold. "Do you know where he went?" "I'm not sure, but I saw him driving a gray car, strange license plate. He was parked near the old park for a while. I don't think he's left town yet." A gust of wind swept through, tossing Irene's hair into her face. She stared into the distance, murmuring, He's really back. Mrs. Eunice studied her for a long moment before speaking gently. Irene, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried because we never truly laid it to rest. What have you been hiding from Jacob? Irene lowered her head, eyes glistening. I just wanted to protect him. From that man. You know as well as I do that man doesn't give up easily, and this time he might not just be here to talk. The words struck Irene like ice. She thanked the old woman and hurried off. The rain had grown heavier, pelting against her coat like 1,000 tiny blows. One thought consumed her: Jacob was in danger, not from the past, but from the man he now trusted. When she got home, Irene tore through every room, the living room, the desk, the drawers. She needed to find something, anything. Finally, in Jacob's desk drawer, she found a small white envelope sealed tight, no name on it. Inside was a glossy photograph. Jacob and David sitting together at a cafe just outside of town, both smiling, relaxed, familiar, almost father and son. Irene's hands shook violently. At the bottom corner of the photo, in neat handwriting, were the words, "He deserves to know who you really are." She sank to her knees, the photo slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the floor. In that instant, Irene understood this wasn't just a confrontation with her past anymore. David was back, and he was taking away the one thing she loved most, piece by piece. That evening, Irene sat in the living room with the lights off. The only glow came from the digital clock on the wall, flashing 22:14. The rain kept falling steady and relentless, as if it never meant to stop. Jacob still hadn't come home. She had called him 4 times. No one answered. With every passing minute, the fear in her chest tightened. She couldn't stay still. She rose and was about to throw on her coat when the whir of an electric bike sounded at the gate. Jacob returned, drenched, his jacket splattered with mud. "Where have you been at this hour?" Irene asked, her voice a mix of worry and anger. "None of your business." "What are you hiding from me?" Jacob raised an eyebrow, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You don't need to know everything about me, Irene." The way he called her Irene froze her. Not Mom. Her heart seemed to drop. "Jacob, what did you just call me?" "The name you like people to call you, right?" Irene, the kind, self-sacrificing woman who's best at hiding things. He threw his backpack on the table, collapsed into a chair, thumbed through a few messages on his phone, then tossed it back down. "He said you would react exactly like this." Irene clenched her fists, fighting to stop shaking. "Who said that?" "The man you erased from your life." The air grew heavy. Irene stepped back, her voice choked. "Jacob, you have to listen to me. That man is not what you think. Enough!" Jacob shouted, his eyes bloodshot. "You have no right to talk about him like that. You robbed me of the chance to know my father. You took everything from him." Irene reached for him, but Jacob stepped back. "Don't come near me. You lied my whole life. I don't want to hear it anymore." He sprinted up to his room and slammed the door, leaving Irene standing there, trembling as if her soul had been torn in two. A long time passed before she could steady herself enough to pick up his backpack. Inside, Jacob's phone was unlocked. On the banking app screen, the latest notification stopped her cold. Received $1,200 from D. Ross. Her fingers curled into a fist. She could hardly breathe. David was not only in contact, he had been financially supporting Jacob. No mistake. Frantically, Irene opened the transaction history. Small, regular transfers beginning 3 months ago. She sank into a chair, her mind reeling. 3 months ago, the same time Jacob started changing, withdrawing, growing cold toward his mother. David had planned all of this. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Lightning briefly illuminated Irene's face, her eyes swollen and red. But now there was something else beneath the fear. Resolve. She walked to the table and laid out the old birth certificate, the torn photograph, and the photo of Jacob with David. Piece by piece, a grim picture formed. The man once convicted years ago, a son now being led by him, and lies being stripped away layer by layer. "No," Irene whispered. "He will not take my son from me again." She opened the wooden cabinet and pulled out an old box of files, the case materials she had kept hidden. Notes, crime scene photos, police reports, all thick with dust. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, and one bold line made her stall. Case: Ross, David, vehicular manslaughter, 2009. Irene drew a long breath, feeling as if a ghost had stepped out of her memories. If David had come back, he would surely try to erase every trace of that past. She closed her eyes and whispered, "If the truth is about to surface, then this time it must be the real truth." The next noon, Irene took leave from her shift. She sat in the car, hands clenched on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the scrawled address on the paper. Evelyn M. Witness, Case 2009. Evelyn, a once close friend, a former colleague, and the only other person who had been with Irene on the night of the accident. 16 years had passed. They hadn't seen each other since, not because of time or distance, but because Irene had wanted to bury that memory forever. The car stopped in front of a small suburban house. The smell of damp wood and dry grass filled the air as she stepped out. The door opened just a crack. A woman's voice came from behind the curtain. "Irene, is that really you?" Evelyn appeared, much grayer, her gaze mixed with confusion and suspicion. The two of them looked at each other for a moment, then Evelyn nodded and invited her in. The little room was plain. The scent of herbal tea lingered in the air. Evelyn poured tea and sat down opposite Irene, her hands slightly trembling. "You've come to see me. After all these years. There must be a reason." Irene nodded faintly, weariness in her eyes. "I need to know. What really happened that night? Is there something wrong in the files? Isn't there, Evelyn?" Evelyn fell silent, then slowly set her cup down. "Irene, I suspected one day you'd ask, but are you sure you really want to hear it?" "Yes, I have no choice." Evelyn exhaled and looked out the window. "I remember it clearly. That night we left the party early. David was drunk. It rained hard, and the car lost control. When I ran over, you were standing by the roadside, covered in blood, and David was unconscious behind the wheel." "Yes," Irene nodded, her voice hoarse. "And I called for an ambulance." "Right. But the next morning the police said they had a statement, claiming David had driven while intoxicated on purpose and caused a fatality. That statement bears your name." Irene frowned. "I never signed that statement." Evelyn looked her in the eye. "I believe you. That morning, the police showed me the original. The signature looked odd. It resembled yours, but not exactly." Irene's heart tightened. "Are you saying someone forged my signature?" "Possibly. But when I tried to ask more, they said the case was closed." I was afraid of trouble, so I stayed quiet." A long silence settled in the room. Irene stared into her steaming cup of tea as the words David had once said echoed in her mind. "You'll pay for this, Irene," she whispered. "If only I had known sooner." Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder. "Irene, now that you've come back to reopen this, what's your reason?" Irene nodded, her voice breaking. "Jacob, my son, David has come to him. He says I framed him. Worse, someone is helping him." Evelyn went pale. "If that's true, it means someone kept the original records. Maybe someone from the old system was bribed." Irene pressed her lips together and took an old file from her bag, setting it on the table. "I kept a copy, but I never checked it closely. Look." Evelyn opened it and flipped through the pages. Suddenly her eyes widened. "Wait, Irene, Do you see something odd? The signature at the end, the witness name. It's Clara Moore. Irene froze. Clara? No, it can't be. Evelyn's voice turned serious. Do you know this person? Irene nodded, her face paling. She's my sister. In that moment, Irene felt the room collapse inward. Her sister, the woman she had trusted, the one who had looked after Jacob when Irene was on duty, appeared on the old case file as the witness who had signed it. Evelyn gripped her hand. If that's true, then it's not just David you're facing, Irene. Someone in your own family may be siding with him. Lightning split the sky outside. Irene closed her eyes as old fear mixed with a slow, burning anger rising within her. If she truly was involved, she whispered, then I will never forgive her. The rain had stopped by late afternoon, but the ground was still slick and soaked. Irene drove home with her mind in chaos. Ever since leaving Evelyn's house, 2 words had echoed relentlessly in her head. Clara Moore. Her sister, the person she had once trusted most. The only one who had stayed by her side when David was arrested, the one who told her to let the past die. But if Clara's signature was on that case file, then she had known everything. When Irene stepped into the house, she froze. A familiar voice drifted from the living room, smooth, calm, laced with something sharp. It's been a long time since you've dared to bring up the past. Clara sat elegantly on the sofa, wearing a gray dress, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes glinting like blades. Jacob sat beside her, his shoulders tense, his gaze avoiding his mother's. Irene stood speechless for a moment before whispering, "What are you doing here?" Clara smiled faintly. Jacob invited me. He wanted someone to tell him the truth. Isn't that right, Jacob? Jacob gave a small nod, his eyes cold when they met his mother's. The floor seemed to drop from beneath Irene. What did you tell my son? Not much, Clara said lightly, standing with her arms folded. Just a few things you worked so hard to bury, about the man you accused, about how you built your whole life on lies. Stop it, Clara, Irene said hoarsely, struggling to keep her composure. You don't understand what happened. Clara's smile thinned, her gaze cutting deep. Oh, I understand perfectly, because I was the one who signed your statement that night. The room went utterly still. Jacob turned sharply toward his mother, his voice rising with anger. So it's true? You're the one who sent him to prison? It's not what you think, Irene cried, stepping forward, tears glistening in her eyes. You don't know the full story, Jacob. I just did what the police told me, Clara interrupted, her tone like ice. You've always been good at that, turning yourself into the victim. Jacob's hands clenched. Mom, why didn't you just tell me the truth from the start? Irene looked at her son, the boy she'd raised, loved, and protected, and every word felt like a knife to the heart. Because I wanted to keep you safe. David isn't who you think he is. Clara's voice sliced through her words, soft but venomous. He's just a man destroyed by a cowardly woman who pretended to be noble afterward. You're no different from him, Irene. The air thickened with tension. Irene's fists trembled. Why are you doing this, Clara? Why turn against me now? Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant for Irene alone. Because I loved him first. The words struck like thunder. Irene staggered back, her eyes wide, her voice caught in her throat. Yes, Clara said with a bitter smile. David was mine, but he chose you. And then you betrayed him. Did you really think I'd ever forgive that? Jacob stood frozen, glancing between the two women, confusion and dread in his eyes. Aunt Clara, what are you talking about? Clara turned to him, her tone gentle, almost soothing. It's all right, Jacob. You just need to understand one thing: adults don't always lie to protect others. Sometimes they lie to hide their sins. "Stop it, Clara!" Irene's scream cut through the air. The tension shattered. Jacob flinched, anger flaring. "You don't need to yell, Mom. I'm done listening to your lies." He grabbed his backpack and stormed upstairs, leaving Irene trembling in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. Clara picked up the torn photograph from the table, brushed her fingers across it, and set it down again. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "You can't hold on to something that was never yours, Irene. Sometimes the truth is the only knife sharp enough to end an illusion." She turned and walked out, her perfume lingering in the air, a cold, delicate trace as silence settled over the house. Irene collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands, her sobs caught in her throat. She no longer knew what was real and what was a lie. All she knew was this: her sister had returned, and this time, Clara didn't just want to hurt her. She wanted to destroy everything. That night, Irene couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jacob's back as he walked away, and Clara's face, calm and cruel, with that faint, haunting smile. Her sister's words echoed again and again in her mind. "Because I loved him before you did." She sat up, her heartbeat pounding. If Clara had once loved David, then everything, the case, the forged statement, the anonymous messages, the way Jacob had been pulled away, might all be part of a revenge plan carefully set in motion long ago. Irene switched on the lamp and opened the old case file again. Her eyes locked on the signature Clara Moore. The handwriting was delicate, slanted to the right, identical to the script on the birthday cards Clara used to send Jacob. There was no doubt. It was her. Clara had done it. Rage and despair tangled inside her. If she wanted to save her son, she needed proof, something undeniable to expose Clara and David's conspiracy. Close to midnight, Irene grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The town lay under a thin veil of fog, streetlights casting pale gold reflections on the wet asphalt. She drove east toward the outskirts, where David's old house still stood abandoned since the accident. The property now belonged to a bank, but no one dared move in. People whispered that lights sometimes flickered inside at night, as if someone still lived there. When Irene pushed through the rusted gate, the hinges screeched like a warning. She shone her flashlight, dust swirled thick in the air. The smell of mold, decaying wood, and old memories clung to every surface. Everything remained the same: the torn curtains, the sagging sofa, the stained wall with a faint shadow where blood had once been. She moved slowly toward David's old desk. The drawer was locked. Irene yanked hard. The hinges gave way, spilling a pile of papers, receipts, letters, and a small black USB stick, thick with dust. A tiny note was taped to it, written in thin, elegant script, "For CM." Irene froze. Clara Moore. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. On the desk lay another yellowed envelope. She unfolded it, only a few lines written inside. "I did everything because of my promise to you. But if Irene finds out, it all falls apart. D." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She stuffed everything into her pocket and hurried out. Behind her, the house fell silent again. Only the wooden door creaked softly in the wind, like the breath of some sleeping beast. Back home, Irene plugged the USB into her computer. A single folder appeared on the screen. Confessions. Inside were dozens of emails exchanged between two addresses: dross09 @ and cmoore @. She opened one at random and froze as she read. From Clara Moore. David, are you sure she won't find out? She still believes you hate her. We have to keep playing our parts. From David Ross. Don't worry. Once Jacob learns the truth, he'll turn his back on her. And then we'll have everything: the truth, redemption, and the boy. Irene sank into her chair, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Clara and David had been working together all along. Tears streamed down her face, hot with betrayal and fury. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Jacob was nothing but a pawn in their game of vengeance. Slowly, Irene lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen, but something inside them had hardened. "Fine," she whispered. "If you want a war, Clara, I won't run this time." She copied every file from the USB, printed the key emails, and locked them in her safe. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. Irene stared at her reflection in the rain-streaked window, pale, trembling, resolute, and knew that from this moment on, everything had gone far beyond the bounds of family. Tôi sẽ giết Đoàn này sang Thiên Anh, Chuẩn mi. Dui day la banjik. That morning, Irene took the USB to the hospital not for work, but to ask a favor of the one person she trusted most, Lucas, the IT engineer in her department who had helped her recover data years ago. The small tech room glowed with the blue light of monitors. Lucas looked up at Irene, frowning. "You said there are some old files that need recovery, right?" Irene nodded. "Yes, I need to know where these files came from and whether anyone tampered with them." Lucas plugged in the USB and scanned the screen. This is strange. These emails weren't just sent from two addresses. A third party accessed them." "A third party?" Irene leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Yes. Some files were downloaded from an IP belonging to a computer inside this hospital." Irene went numb. "What did you say?" Lucas turned the monitor so she could see and pointed at the line of code. Location: St. Bon Martha Hospital, internal network access. "Are you sure?" Irene asked. "This USB was connected here at least twice, months apart." Irene bit her lip. She had worked at the hospital for over 10 years and had never imagined someone from her own workplace could be tied to her past. "Can you see who logged in?" she asked. Lucas typed quickly, then frowned. "The account used is named See More." Irene felt the blood drain from her face. "Clara." Lucas looked at her, worried. "Irene, what's going on? Should I report this to security?" Irene shook her head, her voice hoarse. "No, thank you. But please don't tell anyone about this. Pretend you never saw it, okay?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "If you need technical help, just tell me." Irene left the room with her heart racing. In the long, brightly lit hospital corridor, her shadow stretched thin and lonely. Clara had logged into the hospital system. For what purpose? She remembered the past weeks when Clara had visited, bringing gifts for Jacob. At the time, she had assumed it was just a sister visiting her nephew. Now she wondered if Clara had used those visits to copy files or a USB drive. On the way home, Irene stopped by the old cafe where she and Clara used to sit for hours talking when they were young. There she ran into Nancy, the warm-hearted owner who knew most of the town's gossip. "Irene, long time no see. Jacob's gotten so tall," Nancy said. Irene forced a smile. "Yes, he's growing up." Nancy poured coffee and lowered her voice. "Lately I've seen your sister Clara come here with a man. They sit in that corner." Irene startled. "A man? Do you know who?" Nancy furrowed her brow, trying to remember. "A tall, slightly gray hair, wears a gold watch. Kind of city-sounding. I think they called each other David." The coffee trembled in Irene's hand. "How long have they been coming?" "About a month now. Every weekend. Once I overheard them talk about Jacob, they said the boy would soon learn the truth." Irene felt numb. David, Clara, Jacob. The three names intertwined into a tightening knot around her. Before leaving the cafe, Irene paused at the glass door and looked at her reflection. Her face was pale and tired, but something new had begun to shine in her eyes, the hardness of someone ready to confront the past. She thought to herself, if they want to pull Jacob to their side, I will win him back with the very truth they fear most. She clenched her fist. The warm yellow light reflected in her reddened eyes, and another Irene was born. Not the fragile mother, but a woman poised to unlock the gates to her own hell. That afternoon, the sky was the color of ash. Irene drove toward the outskirts of town to a quiet residential block that had once been the police headquarters. According to the old case records, the officer in charge of David Ross's case back in 2009 was Harold Phelps, now long retired. She stopped in front of a small red brick house at the end of the street. The front door was ajar, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air. A gravelly voice called out as she knocked. "Come in. I figured it'd be you, Nurse Irene, right?" Irene froze. "You know me?" Harold gave a dry laugh and gestured to the pile of papers on his table. "That name's not easy to forget. You were right at the center of one of the messiest cases I ever worked." He looked to be in his 60s, his beard speckled with gray, his eyes sharp but tired. Irene sat across from him, her pulse quickening. "I'm not here to reopen wounds," she said quietly. "I just need the truth." "Something about that case wasn't right, was it?" Harold took a slow drag from his cigarette and exhaled. "You think I haven't asked myself that for years?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old file, tossing it onto the table. "I kept a copy. I wasn't supposed to, but I couldn't rest easy when the original was sealed so fast." Irene opened it carefully. The pages were faded, parts redacted with thick black ink. Then she noticed a line in the forensics report, faintly crossed out. No fingerprints belonging to David Ross found on the steering wheel. Her heart tightened. "But the final report said he was driving." Harold nodded. "That's right, but the original didn't. Someone changed that detail during the final edit." "Who?" Harold shrugged. "No proof, but I remember only 2 people had clearance to access the file, the lead investigator and the supplemental witness, Clara Moore." The room went still. Irene stared at the name Clara and felt the air leave her lungs. Harold stubbed out his cigarette, his voice dropping low. "I'm not saying David Ross was innocent, but back then I felt something was being covered up. They wanted the case closed fast, before the press dug deeper. David pled guilty too quickly, almost like he was protecting someone." Irene's voice trembled. "Protecting someone?" "Maybe you," Harold said softly. "Or someone else in your family." The words hit like ice water. Irene's hands clasped tightly together. If that's true, then David wasn't the one driving that night. Harold looked at her with weary sympathy. "I'm not making claims, but I've seen cases like this before. When love, guilt, and fear intertwine, people do things even they can't comprehend." He leaned forward, his tone almost gentle. "Sometimes the person you think you're protecting is the one who pushed you over the edge." Irene sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door like a sigh from the past. She finally stood, thanked him quietly, and turned to leave. Just before she reached the door, Harold called out, "Irene, if you're really planning to dig this up, be careful. Not everyone wants the truth uncovered. Some people lose everything for chasing it." She nodded faintly and stepped out. The door closed behind her, and the dim afternoon light fell across her face, torn between fear and determination. As she drove away, one thought echoed in her mind. If David was framed, then who was really behind the wheel that night? And deep inside her, something began to tremble, not just from fear, but from the terrifying possibility that it might have been her. Night fell. Irene sat alone in the living room, the desk lamp casting a pale yellow glow over a pile of old documents. On the table lay 3 things: the copy of the forensic report Harold had given her, the letter from the USB between Clara and David, and a faded photograph taken on the night of the crash. She stared at them, fragments of a story that no longer fit together. In her memory, that night was a nightmare. The downpour, the screech of tires, headlights flaring. Then the crash, a blinding sound of metal and glass shattering. When she opened her eyes, blood had smeared the windshield. David was unconscious, and the driver was dead. She remembered screaming for help. And the next morning, the report said David had been behind the wheel. But now, the evidence told a different story. If there were no fingerprints from David on the steering wheel, then who had been driving? And why was Clara's signature in the official record? Irene closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. Her memories blurred, warped, as if she'd only ever been allowed to remember the version someone wanted her to believe. The buzz of her phone snapped her back. A new message from an unknown number. "I know what you're looking for. There's something you need to see. D." Her breath caught. Beneath the message was a GPS location, an old cafe on the edge of town, the same place she'd met David the night before his arrest. Irene sat motionless. A part of her wanted to delete the message, pretend it never came. But another part, the one starving for the truth, refused to stay quiet. She grabbed her coat and stepped into the night. The cafe stood by a sloping road, its sign flickering weakly in the rain. Inside, it was almost empty. Irene entered, heart pounding. A man sat in the shadowed corner, his silhouette long against the wall. When she approached, he looked up David. Time had carved deep lines across his face, his beard uneven, eyes hollow, yet piercingly familiar. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he rasped, voice low and rough. Irene stood still. "I came to hear the truth." David smirked faintly. "The truth? Are you sure you want it? Because once you know, you may never trust yourself again." Her jaw tightened. "I haven't trusted anyone for 16 years. You owe me an answer." David's gaze held hers. "That night, I wasn't the one driving. You know that. You were in the back seat, and the person behind the wheel." He paused, eyes hardening with something between anger and grief. "Was Clara." The air in the cafe froze. Irene stepped back, her pulse roaring in her ears. "You're lying. My sister wasn't there. She was home with Jacob." David gave a dry laugh. "That's what she told you, isn't it? But think, Irene, who called the police? Who signed the statement? Who handled everything afterward? And tell me, did you ever see Clara cry for the man who died?" Each word cut into her memory like a blade. Irene gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "That can't be true." "Oh, it can," David said coldly. "She was driving. She lost control. She hit the man. I took the blame because I was a fool who still loved you. But later, Clara changed her statement. She made sure everything pointed to me." He pulled a crumpled paper from his jacket and slid it across the table. "This is a copy of the original witness report. Her fingerprints are on it. I've kept it all these years. I knew someday you'd need to see." Irene picked it up, trembling. The handwriting, the fingerprint. It was unmistakably Clara's. The world tilted around her. She didn't know who to believe anymore, Harold. Who suspected a cover-up? David, the man who'd destroyed her life, or her own shattered, unreliable memories? David's voice softened. "I don't want revenge. I just want my son to know I'm not the monster she made me out to be." Irene rose, tears streaking down her face. "If what you're saying is true, then the one who should be afraid isn't me." She turned and walked out into the cold rain. Behind her, David's voice echoed through the night. "Be careful of your sister, Irene. She's far more dangerous than I ever was." Driving home, Irene kept glancing into the rearview mirror. In the darkness, a pair of headlights flared then disappeared. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Her heartbeat thundered. The old fear had returned. But this time, it carried something new, the gnawing dread that she might be losing the last fragments of truth she had left to believe in. Duide, la bandik sang ting ein, chuan mi, quoduan van ban vuagui. That night, Irene didn't get home until nearly midnight. It was still drizzling. The road was eerily quiet. When she pulled up at the gate, she immediately sensed something wrong. The gate was ajar, though she clearly remembered locking it that morning. She shut off the engine and stepped out silently, her heart racing. "Jacob?" she called softly, but no answer came. The house was pitch dark. She switched on the lights. A cold yellow glow filled the rooms. Everything looked undisturbed except for one thing. The drawer of her desk was wide open. Irene walked over, her chest tightening. The files she had kept inside the copied witness statements, the USB drive, the old photos were gone. She stood frozen, her hands trembling. Her phone rang an unknown number. She answered, voice hoarse. "Who is this?" A few seconds of silence, then a familiar, steel-cold female voice came through. "Haven't you learned to hide things better yet, Irene?" It was Clara. Irene gripped the phone. "You took them?" "Yes, and you should thank me. If anyone else had seen those things, you'd have no chance to explain yourself." "What are you afraid of, Clara? Afraid of the truth?" A soft, chilling laugh on the other end. "The truth is a double-edged knife, sister. I'm just making sure it doesn't cut the wrong people. You sound like a criminal, and you sound like someone about to lose everything." Then the line went dead. Irene collapsed to the floor, her tears spilling out. She felt strangled by the web her own family had spun. Everything she'd held, the evidence, the data, the truth had vanished in an instant. She reached for her phone to call Jacob, then stopped. He still wasn't home, and now she wasn't even sure who he was with. Her computer on the desk stayed on. A notification glowed on the screen. New login detected from unknown device. She opened the access log. Someone had logged in remotely about 20 minutes earlier and downloaded a series of files named Confessions, Case Ross 2009, Jacob Personal. "No, this can't be," Irene murmured. Someone was watching her every move. In desperation, she dug through her safe for whatever remained. At the bottom, she found an old hard drive, the one she'd once used to store medical records from the hospital. When she plugged it in, a folder named Archived Reports appeared. Among hundreds of files, she recognized one name: Accident 09, confidential.mp4. She opened it. The footage was grainy, taken from a traffic camera, but it clearly showed the night of the accident. A black car skidded on the wet road and struck the guardrail. A door opened. A tall woman with long hair stepped out, Clara. She stood beside the driver's seat, bent down, and pulled David out. Moments later, the headlights of another car appeared. Irene ran up, panicked, and called for an ambulance. Irene stared at the screen, her hands shaking. It was her. She was driving. She rewound the video, peering closely at the frames, then paused on the clearest shot. The headlight glare illuminated Clara, her eyes wild, her lips moving as if she whispered something the camera didn't catch. Irene whispered, "Why did you do this, Clara?" Suddenly, a tiny click sounded at the window. Irene jumped and looked out. A dark shape flashed past the trees. Headlights flared, then went out. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding, but outside there was only the patter of rain and an empty street. She photographed the frame showing Clara from the video and backed it up to an external drive. Under the flickering light, she breathed, voice shaking. "If they want to bury the truth, I'll dig it up by any means." And in that moment, Irene was no longer the frail mother she had been. She had become the sole living witness to the crime her sister had orchestrated. Here's the English translation in American style, faithful to tone and emotion. The next morning, Irene decided she wouldn't run anymore. She opened her laptop, replaying the traffic camera footage again and again, Clara's face flashing clearly in the headlights, undeniable. She printed the still frame, sealed it in an envelope, and drove straight to her sister's house. The small white villa on the hillside stood quiet and pristine. When Irene knocked, it was Jacob who opened the door. He froze for a moment when he saw her, his eyes cold, distant. "So, you're here," Irene said hoarsely. "I came to help Aunt Clara organize some things. What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, a familiar voice drifted from behind him. "Oh, you came after all?" Clara appeared, dressed in a white robe, wearing that same faint, composed smile. "I was just making coffee. Would you like some?" Irene's gaze hardened. "I didn't come here for coffee." "Oh? Still chasing ghosts from the past? You must be exhausted, Irene." Irene pulled the photograph from her bag and laid it on the table. "Then explain this." Clara bent over, glanced at the photo, and smiled. "Impressive. You've always been clever with tech. Where'd you edit this one?" Irene blinked. "What? The video, the photo, the sound? You know anyone can fabricate things now, right? Did you really go so far as to fake evidence just to blame me?" Jacob frowned. "Mom, is that true?" Irene turned to him, panicked. "No, you have to believe me. This is real traffic footage. I restored it last night." Clara tilted her head slightly, her tone soft, almost tender. "See, Jacob, when someone's haunted by guilt, they'll invent anything to defend themselves." "Stop it, Clara," Irene snapped. Clara met her eyes, her expression icy calm. "You destroyed his life, and now you want to destroy mine too? You're the one who put him in prison. You were driving that night, not me, not David." "Do you have proof?" Clara sneered. "Or just the distorted memory of a woman who once had a breakdown?" Jacob stepped between them, fists clenched. "Enough," he shouted. "I can't take this anymore." "You always say you did everything to protect me, but you're just making things worse." "Jacob, you don't understand." "No, you don't. Aunt Clara never said a bad word about you, but all you do is accuse her. If you're making this up, I can't forgive you." Irene felt her heart collapse inside her chest. You believe her over me?" Jacob looked away. "I believe what makes sense." The words cut deeper than any blade. Clara placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. "It's all right, Jacob. Adults lose their way sometimes. We shouldn't hold it against them." Then she turned back to Irene with that poisonous smile. "You see? Your son's old enough now to tell what's real and what's not." Irene trembled, tears streaming down her face. She reached for Jacob, but he stepped back. "Mom, please, stop. I'm tired." In that moment, Irene understood she had lost. Not because she lacked evidence, but because Clara had stolen the one thing she couldn't replace: her son's trust. When she left Clara's house, the rain began to fall again. Irene stood on the porch, staring into the gray curtain of water. Inside, through the window, she saw Clara's hand resting on Jacob's shoulder, whispering something in his ear. He lowered his head, his face dark with confusion. A flash of lightning illuminated Irene's face, pale, wet, but burning with a fierce, desperate light. "You can fool everyone, Clara," she whispered, "but you'll never bury the truth forever." She turned and walked away, her steps echoing against the wet stone, each one like the heavy, broken heartbeat of a mother betrayed by the sister she once loved and the son she could no longer reach. Here's the fluent American English translation, keeping the full tone, pacing, and emotional depth of your original text. The next morning, Irene decided she wouldn't hide anymore. She opened her laptop, replaying the traffic camera footage again and again, Clara's face caught in the beam of the headlights, clear and undeniable. She printed that frame, slipped it into an envelope, and drove straight to her sister's house. The small white villa on the hillside stood silent, immaculate. When Irene knocked, it was Jacob who opened the door. He froze when he saw her, his eyes cold, distant.